Hi, I want to show a quick example of how you can get started with conceptual understanding and learning transfer. So I've got on my screen here an 8th grade social studies example from Alberta, Canada. It's about the Renaissance, so I just picked something at random, but it's something I think the steps I'm going through you can apply to whatever you have to teach. So the first step that I always sort of look for when I'm thinking about teaching for conceptual understanding is, of course, I look at my learner outcomes or my standards of learning, and I say, okay, what do I need to teach? And through that, I look for the concepts or the organizing ideas. And so here, the way that this particular one is organized, some standards documents look like this and some don't. They have a general outcome, like a big sort of meaty thing, and then there's the specific outcomes you can see below. So when I look at the general outcome through an examination of I see, okay, the specific content I need to teach is Renaissance Europe. That's not necessarily a concept. That's not an organizing idea that transfers across multiple situations. And so then I keep reading, demonstrate an understanding and an appreciation of how the exchange of ideas, so that's a concept, exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge, shape worldview. So worldview is a concept of the Western world. In the Western world, I would say, that's a tough one. It's still kind of a concept. It's still this organizing idea that does sort of transfer. It's big enough that I decided to put it in there. So I go over here to my brainstorming planning document and I just put all the concepts that I see. So just this particular set of learning outcomes I see when I look at the general, and then I also look at these values and attitudes, and I also look at the knowledge and understanding pieces. These are all the concepts that I picked out. So I go to this brainstorming planning document: exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge, worldview, Western world, belief, values, time, geographical location, societal context. These are all words straight from that learner outcome document. Trade, city-states, thinkers, philosophers, humanist worldview, age of discovery, imperialism, expansionist, exploration, intercultural, contact, citizenship, and identity. And again, these are tricky. The Western world, the proper nouns, Western world, age of discovery, I still just throw them in there just to know these are all the things, sort of the content pieces that I want kids to understand. So the next step is to sort of sort these. And I looked at all these and I just said, that's a lot. Is there one that sort of is the foundation of which everything else kind of spawns out from that? And to me, when I look at this, if students don't understand the concept of identity, then worldview, and that there's differing worldviews and that they change over time, that's gonna be really hard. So I decided to start with identity, and I thought I would start with modeling, like a drawing of who am I. So I draw Miss Stern. I'm a mom. I'm a sister. I'm a wife. I'm a teacher. I love to go to the beach. I love to read books. Just sort of put a lot of things about who I am and what I believe, what I value, and use that as a model to think aloud for students to do that for themselves. So I thought if students start with who are you, what's your identity, we could kind of keep coming back to that when we're looking at something so far in time, such as the Renaissance. That's hard for an 8th grader to quite wrap their head around. And so I would sort of transition from identity to worldview. How do I see the world? And sort of maybe start to make some connections between how does your identity, who you are, influence your worldview, how you see the world. And just doing a quick Google search, I found that Learn Alberta has this resource. So I just put it in there. Often I'll just Google search, and teachers probably do this all the time. You'll Google search and you'll find these resources. So this is a resource about exploring worldviews and some different activities, suggested activities. So if I find things like that on my brainstorming planning document, I just sometimes throw them in there. How am I going to get kids to understand what these concepts are? So pretend that I've done that for all of these concepts here. I've sort of brainstormed in step 2. How am I going to have kids make meaning of all of these things? The next step that I want to think about when I'm planning is, are those conceptual questions about the relationship between and among concepts? And so if I look back at my specific outcomes, I look at the big general one. Through an examination of Renaissance Europe, students will demonstrate an understanding and appreciation of how the exchange of ideas and knowledge contributed to shaping the worldview of the Western world? And so I said, how can I take all of that and make it an abstract question that can transfer across different situations? And so I came up with, how does the exchange of ideas and knowledge influence people's worldview? That's our sort of big mama question. We'll be exploring the Renaissance through that, but I want kids to see from the start that we are using the Renaissance to understand this big question about exchange of ideas and worldview. And so then the next step is to think about the context. And you also want to come up with more conceptual questions, not just one. And so in this case, here's one straight from the standards documents or the learner outcomes document have this question, and I would just turn it into something more transferable. So instead of how did, I would say how does, to make it present tense. How does the physical geography of Renaissance Europe, I would just take that out. How does physical geography affect trade? How does physical geography affect trade and competition among, and I would just take out European, among countries? How does physical geography affect trade and competition among countries? Then students can start to see where I live in my country and how does the physical geography affect the trade and the competition. And then going to the context, what are my fact-rich examples that are my learning experiences that are going to illuminate the answer to that question? Again, always grounding in the learner outcomes. My context in this case is the Renaissance. And maybe I'll zoom in on artists. How does the exchange of ideas among artists influence people's worldview? And then I want to think about how I'm going to get kids to answer that question. So I give them this sentence stem. I understand that the exchange of ideas and knowledge, what people's worldviews? I want students to fill that in. And then I give them this sentence stem. For example, in the Renaissance, this artist did this. Like, they have to ground that answer in the context that they're exploring. And so then step 5 is to think of additional context. So this is just one way you can think about it. The Renaissance is such a huge period, and those learner outcomes are so big that I thought I could zoom in on the artist for the first context. Then I could come back and answer that question. How does exchange of ideas impact people's worldview? Now I'm going to look at it from the worldview, or from the perspective of religious leaders. How do religious leaders impact people's worldviews? And then I'm going to go to writers, because they were really important during the Renaissance. How do writers influence people's worldviews? Then I'm going to go to traders, because this learner outcome has a lot about trade. How do people who are in charge of sort of trading goods across countries influence people's worldviews? So I hope that makes sense to you about how we're using transfer to deepen and refine our understanding about exchange of ideas, about worldviews, which is completely what that general learner outcome is about. We're setting it up in an intentional way, so we're not covering the Renaissance, but we're using the Renaissance to unlock sort of this rich conversation about exchange of ideas and people's worldview. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope this was useful. Thanks.